Most people remember The Nesting as a forgotten horror film about a woman, a remote house, and birds that turn violent. A minor title from the early 80s, something derivative, something easily dismissed. But what if the birds were never the threat? What if the real horror of this film had nothing to do with animals, and everything to do with isolation, buried history, and a fear that everyone else refused to take seriously? Before a single attack happens, the film traps its protagonist inside a space shaped by past violence, a house built on unresolved crimes, a woman whose fear is treated as weakness, even when it is the only thing responding accurately to what surrounds her. This is not a story about things suddenly going wrong. It is about what happens when warning signs are ignored long enough that disaster feels inevitable. This video is not here to retell The Nesting. It is here to examine 20 details that quietly reveal what the film was really doing and why it was never meant to feel safe. 1. The Nesting was conceived during a moment when horror marketing was actively flattening complex stories into simple threats. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, horror films were increasingly sold through a narrow promise, a clear menace, a visible danger, a repeatable formula that could be summarized in a single image or tagline. This shift did not necessarily reflect what filmmakers were creating, but it strongly shaped how those films were framed once they reached audiences. The Nesting entered the market at precisely this moment of compression. Production records and contemporary trade coverage suggest that the film was positioned primarily as an animal horror picture, leaning heavily on imagery of attacking birds. This framing aligned it with recent commercial successes that emphasized spectacle over psychology. Yet, within the film itself, the birds occupy surprisingly little narrative control. They appear late, sporadically, and often reactively. Their presence escalates only after the protagonist has already been psychologically and spatially cornered. This mismatch between content and presentation matters. When a film is marketed as one thing, audiences instinctively judge it by those expectations. Scenes that do not deliver immediate payoff are read as failures rather than signals. In The Nesting, the slow accumulation of unease, history, and isolation was not perceived as deliberate pacing. It was seen as absence. On its own, this could be dismissed as a common industry problem, but when viewed as evidence, it reframes the film's reception. The question becomes less about what the film did wrong, and more about what it was never allowed to be understood as in the first place. Sometimes a story is not rejected because it is unclear, but because it was introduced under the wrong terms. 2. The protagonist's agoraphobia is established before any supernatural or violent threat appears, setting the true axis of fear early. From the opening act, the film defines its central character through restriction rather than danger. Her fear is not triggered by the house, the birds, or the past she has yet to uncover. It already exists. The outside world is overwhelming, unstable, and psychologically unsafe. Movement itself is a problem. Choice is limited not by circumstance, but by internal constraint. This matters because it positions the narrative from the inside out. The decision to relocate to an isolated house is not an act of curiosity or bravery. It is a coping mechanism. The house represents control, boundaries, and a reduction of stimuli. In that sense, the setting is initially therapeutic rather than ominous. Safety is defined by enclosure. As a result, the later emergence of violence does not introduce fear, it repurposes it. The film does not ask what happens when danger enters a safe space. It asks what happens when the one space designed to contain fear begins to mirror it. The protagonist's psychological condition and the house's history begin to overlap, blurring the line between internal and external threat. If this detail were incidental, it could be ignored, but the film repeatedly reinforces it through framing, pacing, and dialogue. The fear of going outside never disappears. Even as new dangers arise, it remains the baseline. Seen this way, the horror is not an interruption of normal life. It is a continuation of an already unstable equilibrium. 3. The house's Civil War history is not a narrative embellishment, but a structural layer that predates and shapes every event. When the film introduces the house's past, it does so quietly, almost reluctantly. There is no grand flashback, no prolonged exposition. The information arrives in fragments, mentions of wartime violence, hints of crimes committed within the same walls long before the protagonist arrived. The past is present, but not dramatized. This restraint is significant. Rather than using history as a shocking reveal, the film treats it as sediment. The house is not haunted in the traditional sense. It is burdened. Violence is not an anomaly tied to a curse. It is a pattern that has already occurred, been buried, and normalized by time. By anchoring the setting in the Civil War, the film connects private suffering to collective trauma. The protagonist's isolation is personal, but the structure surrounding her was shaped by a national fracture defined by brutality and unresolved moral conflict. The implication is subtle but persistent. Some spaces are not neutral. They carry memory, even when no one is actively remembering. This reframes later events away from randomness. The house does not change because something supernatural arrives. It reveals what has always been embedded within it. If the violence feels inevitable, the film suggests it is not because fate intervened, but because history was never truly cleared away. 4. The film consistently frames the house as a space of observation rather than shelter, long before it becomes a site of violence. From the moment the protagonist settles into the house, the camera resists treating it as a refuge. Interior shots linger longer than expected. Windows are framed not as sources of light, but as boundaries. Hallways are rarely shown as passages forward, but as corridors. That narrow perspective. Even stillness is presented as watchful rather than calm. This visual language establishes an imbalance early. The house does not feel lived in, it feels aware, but that awareness is not supernatural. There are no immediate signs of haunting, no overt suggestion that something is present with intent. Instead, the sensation comes from distance. The camera often holds back, observing the protagonist as if from the structure itself, she is not alone, but she is unaccompanied. What makes this detail important is its consistency. The framing does not escalate when the threat escalates. It is already there. The house watches before it reacts. This suggests that the film's tension is not built through surprise, but through sustained orientation. The audience is taught how to look long before they are told what to fear. If this were accidental, it would fluctuate. It does not. The film commits to this perspective even in scenes with no immediate danger. That persistence turns architecture into a psychological lens rather than a backdrop. The result is a subtle shift. The house does not protect the protagonist from the outside world. It replaces it. 5. The birds function as a consequence of disruption, not as an originating threat. Unlike many animal horror films of the period, the nesting does not introduce its animals as an immediate force of terror. The birds are present in the environment, but they are not emphasized. They do not dominate the early narrative. Their aggression emerges gradually, and crucially, after multiple forms of intrusion have already taken place. This sequencing matters. The film repeatedly places human action before animal response. Renovations disturb the structure. Objects tied to the house's past are uncovered. Boundaries are crossed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through ignorance. Only then does nature react. The birds do not initiate chaos, they escalate it. By delaying their transformation into a threat, the film reframes them as indicators rather than antagonists. They mark a shift in equilibrium. Something has been displaced, and the environment answers. This is not presented as vengeance or intelligence, it is closer to reflex. If the birds were meant to be the central horror, the film would grant them narrative authority earlier. It does not. Their late arrival suggests they are symptoms of a deeper disturbance that predates both the protagonist and the audience's expectations. This raises a quiet question. If the birds are reacting, what exactly are they reacting to, and why now? 6. Male authority figures in the film consistently minimize or redirect the protagonist's perception of threat. Throughout the story, the protagonist's concerns are repeatedly reframed by others as exaggeration, instability, or misinterpretation. Medical explanations are offered, rational dismissals are applied, her fear is treated as something to be managed rather than investigated. This pattern appears early and continues even as evidence accumulates. What makes this detail significant is its tone. The dismissals are rarely cruel, they are calm, procedural, and confident. Authority does not shout her down, it reassures her into silence. The implication is not that she is wrong, but that her perspective is unreliable by default. This dynamic has a direct narrative effect. Delays in response, missed opportunities for intervention, a growing isolation that is reinforced rather than alleviated. The protagonist is not only trapped by her condition and her environment, but by a system that interprets her distress as internal noise rather than external signal placed within the broader context of the film. This pattern aligns closely with its historical and psychological themes: violence that is normalized, warnings that arrive too early to be believed, structures that outlast those who suffer inside them. If authority consistently reframes fear as weakness, at what point does ignoring perception become its own form of harm? 7. The film treats isolation not as a temporary condition, but as a closed system that slowly rewrites perception. As the narrative progresses, the protagonist's isolation stops functioning as a circumstance and begins operating as a rule. Time stretches unevenly. Days blur. The absence of regular human interaction is no longer a gap to be filled, but a new baseline reality. The film reinforces this by reducing narrative markers that would normally orient the audience. External reference points fade. Routine replaces progression. This is not presented as immediate deterioration. In fact, the early stages of isolation appear stabilizing. The protagonist writes, "She settles, she controls her space, but gradually, that control becomes recursive." With no external correction, thoughts echo back on themselves. Fear is no longer tested against the outside world, it is refined internally. What makes this detail important is how deliberately the film avoids signaling a clear, psychological break. There is no single moment where reality fractures. Instead, the film lets isolation do what it often does in real life. It reshapes interpretation. Ambiguity becomes threatening not because it is extreme, but because there is no alternative lens. Seen this way, the horror does not arrive suddenly. It incubates. Isolation does not cause violence, but it removes resistance to it. The question the film leaves open is unsettling. If perception changes slowly enough, how would anyone recognize the moment it became unreliable? 8. The discovery of the house's hidden spaces mirrors the uncovering of suppressed history rather than accidental exploration. When concealed rooms, objects, and passages are revealed, the film avoids the language of surprise. These moments are not framed as shocking discoveries, but as inevitabilities. The spaces feel less like secrets and more like omissions waiting to be corrected. The house does not suddenly reveal itself, it allows itself to be seen. This distinction matters. The protagonist does not search for these areas out of curiosity or thrill-seeking. She encounters them through necessity, routine, and gradual intrusion into the structure's deeper layers. The act of uncovering is not heroic, it is uncomfortable and destabilizing. By treating hidden spaces as historical residue rather than narrative twists, the film aligns physical discovery with psychological reckoning. Just as the protagonist cannot remain untouched by the house's past, the house cannot remain closed forever. What was buried resurfaces not because it was summoned, but because it was never truly resolved. This approach reframes the notion of haunting. There is no external force demanding attention. The past asserts itself simply by existing. Silence becomes the only unnatural condition. If suppressed, history always resurfaces eventually. The real variable is not whether it magical. 9. The film's pacing resists escalation in favor of accumulation, a choice that directly affected its reception. Rather than building toward a single explosive midpoint or continuous shocks, the nesting accumulates tension through repetition and variation. Similar scenes recur with slight shifts. Familiar spaces are revisited under altered conditions. Threat does not escalate linearly, it thickens. This structural choice places demands on the audience. Attention must be sustained. Meaning emerges through comparison rather than surprise. For viewers expecting a conventional horror rhythm, this can register as stagnation, but within the film's internal logic, it is consistent. The experience of dread is not a spike, it is a pressure. At the time of release, this pacing worked against the film. Critics and audiences accustomed to clearer narrative acceleration often read the restraint as lack of direction. The film's refusal to signal when something is about to happen made it harder to consume casually, seen as evidence. However, the pacing reveals intention. The film does not want fear to feel episodic. It wants it to feel environmental. Always present, occasionally visible, never fully absent. If horror is meant to reflect lived anxiety rather than spectacle, escalation may not be the most honest structure. 10. The film's use of sound prioritizes absence and intrusion over musical guidance. For long stretches, the nesting withholds traditional musical cues that would normally instruct the audience how to feel. Silence dominates scenes that, in another film, would be underlined by tension-building scores. When sound does enter, it often does so abruptly. A noise breaks the quiet rather than emerging from it. The effect is disorienting rather than reassuring. This choice alters the viewer's relationship with the space. Without music to signal safety or danger, the audience is forced to listen the way the protagonist listens. Every sound becomes ambiguous. Footsteps may be internal, movement may be environmental. The distinction is rarely clarified. Sound does not explain the image, it interrupts it. What makes this detail significant is its restraint. The film does not rely on sonic shocks as punctuation. It uses them as violations. Silence establishes a fragile order. Noise fractures it. This mirrors the protagonist's psychological state, where calm is always provisional and easily disrupted. If sound were used conventionally, fear would be externalized. Instead, it remains internal, triggered by uncertainty rather than confirmation. In this context, silence is not peace. It is a condition that must be protected and one that never lasts. 11. The protagonist's profession as a writer is central to how the film constructs reality. The film does not treat writing as a decorative character trait. It shapes how events are processed. Writing is solitary. It requires prolonged attention inward. It blurs the line between observation and invention. The protagonist's daily life is structured around interpretation, revision, and internal logic. This matters because the film consistently aligns perception with narration. What is seen is often filtered through her subjective framing. Details are noticed, revisited, and recontextualized the way a writer would reconsider a sentence. The house becomes a text to be read, rather than a location to be escaped. Importantly, the film never suggests that her profession makes her delusional. It suggests the opposite. She notices patterns others dismiss. She connects fragments. Her interpretations are questioned not because they are illogical, but because they arrive without institutional validation. By anchoring the narrative in a writer's perspective, the film complicates the idea of unreliable perception. The issue is not whether she is imagining events, it is whether her ability to interpret them is being taken seriously. If reality is mediated through narrative, whose version carries authority, becomes the real point of conflict. 12. The violence in the film is staged to feel abrupt rather than cathartic. When violence finally occurs, it does not resolve tension. It interrupts it. The scenes are often brief, chaotic, and emotionally dissonant. There is little buildup and even less release. The aftermath is not framed as triumph or closure. It lingers awkwardly, leaving damage without explanation. This approach distances the film from exploitation. Violence is not used as spectacle or payoff. It is treated as a rupture that fails to answer the questions that preceded it. The audience is not rewarded for waiting. They are unsettled by the absence of meaning. This staging aligns with the film's broader thematic logic. Violence is not a solution. It is a consequence of prolonged neglect, denial, and accumulation. When it arrives, it feels wrong because it is wrong. It does not fit neatly into narrative structure. If the film had offered clearer catharsis, it might have been easier to classify and consume. Instead, it leaves discomfort unresolved. Sometimes the most disturbing violence is not what happens, but the fact that it explains nothing. 13. The film's treatment of sexuality is deliberately muted, denying the audience a familiar source of motivation or explanation. In many horror films of the period, sexuality functions as either a trigger for violence or a moral shorthand. Desire leads to danger, transgression invites punishment. The nesting resists this pattern almost entirely. Sexuality exists at the edges of the narrative, acknowledged but never centered, present but rarely dramatized. This restraint is notable because it removes an easy interpretive shortcut. The protagonist is not framed as reckless, provocative, or morally compromised. Her vulnerability does not stem from desire, nor is it punished through spectacle. Instead, intimacy is portrayed as cautious and secondary to survival. Relationships remain tentative. Physical closeness does not promise safety or transformation. By minimizing sexual motivation, the film redirects attention to structural forces. Fear arises from space, history, and isolation rather than from personal transgression. Violence cannot be explained away as consequence. It must be confronted as something that emerges from context rather than choice. This approach complicates the audience's role. Without a moral script to rely on, viewers are forced to sit with discomfort that has no clear cause. The film does not offer an answer to why this woman suffers. It only shows that she does. If horror often relies on implication through desire, what happens when desire is removed from the equation entirely? 14. The film avoids assigning a single antagonist, dispersing threat across systems rather than individuals. At no point does the nesting clearly designate one force as responsible for the unfolding danger. There is no singular villain to confront, no entity whose defeat would restore order. Instead, threat emerges from overlap, psychological fragility, historical residue, environmental reaction, institutional dismissal. Each contributes partially, none alone are sufficient. This diffusion of responsibility has a profound effect on narrative tension. Without a central antagonist, there is no obvious strategy for resolution. Escape does not guarantee safety. Confrontation offers no certainty. The film presents danger as systemic rather than intentional. This choice also alters how the audience assigns blame. There is no satisfaction in identifying a culprit. The discomfort persists because it cannot be localized. The horror is not someone, it is a condition. Seen in this light, the film's ambiguity is not evasive. It is diagnostic. It reflects situations where harm results from convergence rather than conspiracy. If no single force is in control, the question shifts from who caused this to how it was allowed to continue. 15. Critical responses at the time often mistook restraint for incompetence. Contemporary reviews frequently cited the film's pacing, ambiguity, and tonal inconsistency as flaws. Scenes were described as underdeveloped, motivations were labeled unclear, the absence of a dominant threat was read as confusion rather than intention. In many cases, criticism focused less on what the film attempted and more on what it refused to provide. This reaction is revealing. The standards used to judge the film were calibrated toward clarity, escalation, and payoff. The nesting offered none of these reliably. It withheld explanation. It delayed action. It concluded without firm resolution. In doing so, it violated expectations without signaling that it was doing so deliberately. With distance, these same qualities appear differently. What was once seen as hesitation reads as control. What was labeled inconsistency aligns with thematic fragmentation. The film's refusal to simplify begins to resemble discipline rather than failure. Reception, in this sense, becomes evidence itself. It shows how easily a work can be misread when its method does not match its market category. If a film is judged by the wrong criteria, can its perceived weaknesses become proof of what it was actually trying to do? 16. The film's climax prioritizes disorientation over resolution, denying the audience a clear psychological or narrative release. As the nesting approaches its final movement, it resists the conventional logic of escalation followed by clarity. Events accelerate, but understanding does not. The camera becomes less stable, spatial relationships fracture, cause and effect blur rather than sharpen. Instead of resolving tension, the film amplifies uncertainty. This choice is crucial. In many horror films, the climax functions as an explanation. The threat is named, confronted, or destroyed. Fear becomes legible. The nesting refuses that comfort. What unfolds feels overwhelming rather than enlightening. The audience is not guided toward a conclusion. They are placed inside the collapse. By denying resolution, the film aligns its ending with the protagonist's internal state. There is no moment of mastery, no regained control. Survival, if it exists at all, does not equate to understanding. The experience ends not with answers, but with exhaustion. This approach reframes the climax as a psychological endpoint rather than a narrative one. The story does not close a loop. It reaches a breaking point. If horror is meant to confront instability, perhaps clarity was never the goal. 17. The absence of clear moral judgment allows violence to exist without justification or lesson. Throughout the film, actions are rarely framed as right or wrong. Decisions are made out of fear, necessity, or confusion rather than moral conviction. When violence occurs, it is not accompanied by condemnation or vindication. The film observes rather than instructs. This neutrality is unsettling. Without moral framing, the audience cannot position themselves comfortably. There is no lesson to extract, no reassurance that suffering serves a purpose. The violence does not correct behavior or restore balance. It simply happens, then leaves damage behind. In this way, the film mirrors real historical trauma more closely than genre convention. Violence is not meaningful because it teaches something. It is meaningful because it persists without explanation. The house's past and the protagonist's present intersect without offering moral clarity. By refusing to moralize, the film resists exploitation. It does not invite pleasure or judgment. It demands endurance. If suffering does not carry a message, what responsibility does the observer hold? 18. The film's legacy has shifted as cultural conversations around psychological trauma have evolved. When The Nesting was released, its portrayal of anxiety, isolation, and perception was often dismissed as weakness or narrative confusion. Psychological distress was treated as a limitation of character rather than a lens through which reality could be interpreted. Over time, that framework has changed. Modern audiences are more attuned to stories where internal states shape external experience. Agoraphobia is now understood as a serious condition, not a personality flaw. Isolation is recognized as destabilizing rather than eccentric. Viewed through this lens, the film's choices appear less opaque and more precise. This shift does not retroactively make the film flawless, but it alters how its intentions are read. What once felt ambiguous now feels cautious. What once felt restrained now feels respectful. The film seems less interested in spectacle than in articulation. Legacy then becomes contingent. A work does not change, but the tools used to interpret it do. If meaning depends partly on when a story is encountered, what other films are waiting to be read differently? 19. The ending of the film refuses to separate personal survival from historical continuity. As the final moments settle, the film offers no clear indication that what has occurred is truly over. Even if the immediate danger appears to subside, the structure that enabled it remains intact. The house still stands, its history is not erased, the past is not exorcised or redeemed. At best, it is momentarily escaped. This is a critical distinction. Many horror films allow survival to function as closure. Endurance becomes victory. In The Nesting, survival feels provisional. The protagonist may leave the space, but nothing suggests that the space itself has been resolved. Violence is interrupted, not corrected. By doing this, the film refuses to frame trauma as an isolated episode. The events we witness are not an exception to history. They are part of it. The personal and the historical remain linked. Even when the narrative stops following one of them, this detail reshapes the ending from ambiguous to intentional. The absence of closure is not neglect. It is the point. Some structures outlast those who suffer within them. If a story ends without resolution, it may be because resolution was never available to begin with. 20. The Nesting ultimately positions fear as a form of awareness rather than weakness. Across the film, fear is treated as something to be managed, suppressed, or dismissed by others, but as events unfold, it becomes clear that fear is also the protagonist's most consistent source of insight. She senses instability before it manifests. She reacts before systems respond. Her anxiety does not create danger, it recognizes it. This inversion is subtle but decisive. The film does not romanticize fear, nor does it present it as empowering. Instead, it frames fear as sensitivity, an attunement to threat shaped by lived experience rather than authority or reassurance. What others call instability, the film suggests may be perception sharpened by vulnerability. Placed at the end of the 20 facts, this idea reframes everything that came before: the house's history, the isolation, the dismissals, the violence. Fear was never the obstacle to understanding. It was the signal that understanding was necessary. The tragedy is not that the protagonist was afraid, it is that her fear was treated as noise. When fear consistently aligns with reality, the question is no longer whether it is irrational, but why it was ignored. Taken individually, the details surrounding The Nesting can appear modest, a marketing decision here, A pacing choice there, a character trait that seems incidental rather than structural, but when these elements are viewed together, patterns begin to emerge that change the way the film reads as a whole. One pattern is repetition without resolution. Violence occurs before the story begins, during it, and continues beyond its end. The house does not transform, authority does not learn, survival does not correct history. This repetition reframes the film away from the logic of crisis and toward the logic of continuity. What happens is not an interruption, it is an extension. Another pattern is misinterpretation. The protagonist's fear is consistently read as dysfunction rather than information. The house's past is treated as background rather than context. Even the birds are misunderstood as aggressors rather than indicators. Again and again, signals are present, but their meaning is dismissed because it does not fit an expected narrative shape. A third pattern is restraint. The film repeatedly withholds what would make it easier to consume: clear antagonists, moral lessons, cathartic release. Instead, it offers proximity to instability without explanation. This restraint is what caused the film to be overlooked, but it is also what gives it durability. The story does not resolve because the conditions it describes do not resolve. This is not a new story. It is a clearer reading of the old one, not a tale about birds turning violent, but about what happens when fear is accurate, history is buried, and structures outlast those trapped inside them. If The Nesting is not a film about birds or spectacle, but about perception, history, and the cost of being ignored, then the way we respond to it matters. Some viewers see a flawed horror movie, others see a quiet study of fear that arrives too early to be understood on its own terms. Which detail in this breakdown shifted your perspective the most? Was it the house as a historical structure, the role of isolation, or the idea that fear itself functions as awareness rather than weakness? Do you think The Nesting was misread because of its time, or because audiences were never meant to feel comfortable with what it was showing? And if so, what other overlooked films deserve to be re-examined through the same lens? Let me know in the comments, and tell me what story we should dissect next.